Hello, today we're going to be talking about factoring trinomials, but this time we're going to be looking at it where the leading coefficient is anything other than 1. So it could be 5, it could be 10, it could be -1, anything other than 1. We're going to use a method. Some people call it the rainbow method, some people call it factor by grouping. So you could decide what works for you, but let's just take a look at it. So if you look at this example, what you'll notice is the number in front of our first term is not a 1. And since we can't factor out the greatest common factor, we have to use, I call it factor by grouping. And I'll show you why. You'll see as we get halfway through the problem. Now, what you do not want to do, I'm going to emphasize this, you do not want to set up two sets of parentheses like we do when this is a 1. When the number in front of the x squared is a 1, that's when you set up two sets of parentheses. When it's anything other than 1, what we do is we bring down our first term, we bring down our last term, and we leave a big space in the middle. And the reason why we leave a big space is because we're actually going to put two terms here in the middle instead of just 1. All right, so let me backtrack a minute. If you go back to the original example, see right here? What we need to do in order to figure out what two terms we're going to put in the middle, what we first do is we find what we call the rainbow number. And this is why some people call it the rainbow method. The rainbow number you get by multiplying the first coefficient and the last one. Okay, you're going to multiply this first, the number in front of the first term, and your last one, number here. So 2 times -7 is -14. Now what we need to do to figure out what two terms to put in this empty space here is we need to come up with two numbers that multiply to the rainbow number and that add to the middle term. Okay, so you could do a little trial and error, however you want to do that, but two numbers that multiply to -14 and add to +13 are right here, 14 and -1. 14 plus -1 gives you that middle term of 13, and 14 times -1 gives you that rainbow number of -14. So this is what we do. In this space that we left right here, we're going to take those two numbers. We're going to take the +14 and the -1, and we're going to put them there. And we need to attach an x to each of them. See how this middle term had an x, right? It said 13x. Whatever's on this middle term is what you're going to put here and here. And the reason being is that if you did combine your like terms, right, 14x minus 1x is 13x. These should combine to give you what we had in the original expression, because shouldn't every step of your expression be equivalent? Okay, so now this is what we did. The reason why I call it factor by grouping is because you're now going to group these 4 terms into 2 separate terms, okay? So if you look down here, I use brackets to group together the first 2 terms, kind of underneath brackets, right? And another pair of brackets to group together the last 2 terms. All right, one thing I want to point out, please do not group them by using parentheses. Do not do this. Sometimes I see people do this, and you are not allowed, because by putting parentheses, you're changing the value of this expression, okay? This says we have 2x squared plus 14x minus 1x minus 7. We have 4 terms being added and subtracted together. When you put parentheses, all of a sudden you're saying, oh, we have multiplication. We want to multiply these 2 terms by these 2 terms, which basically would tell you to double distribute. Okay, that's not what we want to do. Do not put parentheses. So I'm going to take those and erase those off of there. Okay, we don't want those. All right, now, if you look at what I have in this bracket, right, you want to say, well, what could I factor out of these first 2 terms? Well, I can pull out a 2x. And when I do, right, I'm just factoring the greatest common factor out of these 2 terms. So remember, when you factor out the greatest common factor, you rewrite what you're left with within one parenthesis. So I'm left with an x plus 7. Now, when I look at these 2 terms, I mean, there's really nothing to factor out either other than a +1 or a -1. But here, I'm going to factor out a -1. So I'm going to factor out a -1. It's super important, right? -1. And when I do, I'm left with a -1x divided by -1 is +x, and a -7 divided by -1 is +7. See how these right here both say x plus 7? You want these to match, okay? If I had factored out a +1, then this parenthesis wouldn't match with this parenthesis. You want these 2 parentheses to match. Okay, so now we're on our very last step. What you do to write your final factors is you take what's in front of these two common parentheses and you group them together as your first factor. Okay, so I take the 2x and the -1 and I group them together as my first factor. And then I take this common parenthesis and I rewrite it once and once only. Okay, this right here is the factored form of this original expression. If you double distributed everything out and combined your like terms, you would wind up with this original expression. Now, I just want to quickly explain why we write this common binomial once and once only. I know some of you are seeing it. You're like, wait, I see it twice. Why am I writing it only once? Well, this is why. You know how we said every step, right? This expression is equivalent to this expression, which is equivalent to this. Every step of the expression is equivalent as you work your way down. Well, if you were to take this and double distribute it, wouldn't you first distribute the 2x to the x plus 7? And isn't that what this says? 2x times x plus 7? And then wouldn't you take this -1 and distribute it to the x plus 7? And isn't that what this says? -1 times x plus 7. So this is equivalent to this. It's just this one up here is the expanded form, and this is the condensed form. This shows it in factored form. So this would be, our final answer. Okay, one more thing I want to point out before we get to more examples is if you look on the bottom of the page, sometimes you have to first factor out a greatest common factor, right? So even though you see a number other than 1 in front of this first term, aren't all of these numbers even? You could pull a 2 out of each of these and then rewrite what you're left with. And then when you're done with that, since there's a number other than 1 in front of the x squared, you would do the process that I just went over above with what we have here and just keep bringing down that 2. Okay, I'll leave this up to you to look through. I mean, it's actually the same exact example that we had above, right? This is exactly the example I just went over. So I'm going to get to some on the next page. Okay, so if you flip to the next page, I'm going to take a look at a few examples with you. All right, so let's first start with number 33. Okay, so we're going to say our first step is to look, can I factor out a greatest common factor? So no, there's nothing that factors out of all three of these numbers. So because there's a number other than 1 in front of the first term, we're going to do basically the rainbow into factor by grouping. Okay, so in order to do that, we bring down our first term. We're going to leave a big space, and we're going to bring down our last term. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want to come up with, we have to multiply the first and last number, which gives us -42. And we have to come up with two numbers that multiply to -42, but add to -19. Now, I'm going to remind you how you could use the calculator to do this if you want. Okay, so if you want to use your calculator, you go to y equals, and you take the number that you're trying to multiply it to, so -42, and divide that by x. Okay, so now I'm going to hit second graph. I'm going to go to my table of values, and you're going to basically just scroll up and down until you come up with two numbers that you see on the list that add to -19. Now, I mean, I'm looking, I see them right here. It's actually right in front of me. 2 and -21, right? If you add those together, doesn't that give you -19? So that's my pair of numbers. That's what I'm going to use, a +2 and a -21. Okay, so it doesn't matter what order you write it in. So we have a +2 and a -21. I'm going to put the -21 first and the +2 second. It does not matter what order you put them in. I'll show you why off to the side after I finish doing this. Okay, now, because our middle term contained an x, right? It's supposed to be that if we were to combine these two terms, it should give us what we originally started with. So because that contains an x, we need to put x's on these. That way, this original expression is equivalent to this expression. If I combine my like terms, -21x plus 2x is -19x. Okay, so now we want to do grouping. Remember, when you do grouping, please, I mean, you could put brackets. Some people even like to put like a line in between them like this, which is okay, I guess. But do not at all try to put parentheses to group these, because parentheses now mean you're changing the expression. It means you're trying, right? When you have parentheses, it means multiplication. it means you would start double distributing, and that is not what we want to do. So let's get rid of those parentheses, okay? We don't want those there. There we go. Okay, so now I'm going to look at my first two terms and say, well, what can I factor out of these two terms? Well, I could factor out a 7x. And when I do, in parentheses, I'm going to be left with an x minus 3. Okay, now I want to look at these and say, well, what can I factor out? Okay, I could factor out a 2. So when I factor out a 2, and please make sure you write plus 2. Don't just put a 2. Okay, you have to separate this expression from what we're going to write here with either an addition or subtraction. So if you're missing this, it means we have multiplication in between them, and we don't want that. Okay, so I'm going to open up a parenthesis, and after I factor out a 2 out of these two terms, it leaves me with x minus 3, which we could see we're on the right track, right? Because we want what's in our two sets of parentheses to match up, which they do. So once we see these match up, I take what's in front of the common parentheses, so the 7x plus 2, and I group them together in one parenthesis. And then I take the common parenthesis and I rewrite it once. Okay, and that is our answer. Okay, so I'm going to just look at the odds on this page with you. So number 35. Now you first want to look and say, can I factor out a greatest common factor? And there's nothing that we could factor out of those three terms. Okay, so let's just bring down our first term. Remember, leave a big space and bring down the last term. Okay, now in order to figure out what two numbers we're going to use for our terms here and here, we need to come up with first our rainbow number, right? So we can multiply together 8 times negative 27, which is negative 216. And what we have to do is we have to come up with two numbers that multiply to negative 216 and add to negative 6. Okay, so if you're good with numbers in your head, awesome. Even better, it makes these so much easier. But if you're not, negative 216, that's a big number. So let me just do the calculator way with that again. Okay, so in the calculator, you're going to type in the number that the rainbow number, the number we're multiplying to, divided by x, right? And then you can hit second graph, right? Go to your table of values. Now, you may have to scroll up and down because we have to come up with two numbers that add to negative 6. So, I'm looking at these. None of these add up to negative 6, right? The difference is just too big. This adds up to negative 30. This adds up to negative 50. So I'm going to keep scrolling down and see what we have. All right, so we're looking for things that add up to negative 6. Okay, no. Let's see what we got. Oh, right there, look. 12 plus negative 18, right? If you add those, doesn't that add up to negative 6? So what we're going to use is a positive 12 and a negative 18. Okay, so a positive 12 and a negative 18. And again, it does not matter what order you put it in. I was supposed to show you why before, and I never did, so I'm going to show you on this example, okay? Just so I don't forget. Okay, I'm writing it off to the side now so I don't forget. Now, here's the deal. When you put these two numbers, right, remember, we have to attach something to them. And to decide what to attach, you have to look up at this middle term. If that says just an x, we put just an x. But now it says x squared. So we have to attach an x squared to each of these. And remember, the reason being is because if we were to combine these two terms, they should combine to give us what we originally started with. Okay, so let me just put the x squareds here. Okay, I'm going to finish this one later. Let me just look at one at a time. All right, so now we're going to get into grouping. So we group together the first two terms, and we group together the last two terms. Okay, so out of the first two terms, we could pull out a 2x squared, which is going to leave us with 4x squared minus 9. Okay, and if you're having trouble with the, factoring out the greatest common factor, definitely go back and rewatch that video on factoring out the greatest common factor because you're going to see a lot of that. Okay, now out of these two terms, it looks like the only thing we can factor out is a 3. And if you're not sure, remember, you have to be left with the same thing in parentheses. So say in your mind, 12 divided by what will give me 4? Well, 12 divided by 3. So that's probably what we're going to be factoring out. Now, so if we factor out a 3, it's going to leave us with x squared minus 9. Now, I purposely made a mistake because I wanted to see, I wanted to point it out. I wanted to make sure that you guys realize if you leave it like this, okay, unfortunately, this expression is not equivalent to the one above it. If you remember, you have to put a sign in front of here. So if you factor out a positive 3, put a plus sign. If you factor out a negative 3, put a minus sign. Okay, so now we're going to take what's in front of our parentheses. Ooh, I forgot to put my 4 here. Sorry about that. Okay, so now we're going to take what's in front of the parentheses and group them together as our first factor. And we are going to take our common binomial we see here, right? The common term in the parentheses, and rewrite that once and once only. Now, I don't know if you noticed, but in this case, look at this. We can factor further, and you always want to look for that. All right? This is a difference of perfect squares. So we're going to factor this further, right? Dots, we set up 2 sets of parentheses, one's addition and one subtraction, and we take the square root of this first term and put it in the first spot in each parenthesis. And we take the square root of the second term and put it in the second spot in each parenthesis. And then don't forget to bring down this common factor of 2x squared plus 3. Okay, so if we look over here on the left, if you remember, okay, we had our 2 middle terms in the opposite order. Well, watch what happens. Okay, you wind up with these same 2 factors here as we had here. They're just in the opposite order, right? We had the 4x squared minus 9 first and the 2x squared plus 3 second, which is vice versa of what we had here. Okay, so if these are in the opposite order, that's all that happens. You wind up with the same factors, but in the opposite order. And then you would factor this further the same way we did here. Okay, so there you go. Okay, so let's take a look at one last one. All right, in number 37, what you'll notice is you can first factor out a greatest common factor. They are all even, so we could pull out a 2, and they also all contain b's. Well, this one only contains 1, so we can only pull out 1 b. So remember, if your leading coefficient is negative, instead of pulling out a 2b, we want to pull out a negative 2b. Okay, you always pull out the sign of whatever your expression starts with. So I'm going to pull out a negative 2b, and when I do, it leaves me with 4b squared plus 9b, and then plus 2. Okay, so this greatest common factor in the front, that's just going to keep coming down. So you can bring it down. I mean, it's going to come down in every single step. So whatever, you can write it as you got. Now I'm going to open up one big parenthesis, because remember, I need more room. I bring down the first term, leave a big space, and bring down the last term. Okay, so now I need to come up with 2 numbers that multiply to 8 and that add to 9. Okay, so that's kind of an easy one, 8 and 1, right? So I'm going to write plus 8. And then remember, since there's a b on here, we got to attach a b, so plus 8b, and then plus 1b, which I'm just going to write plus b. If you want to put a 1 in front of it, you can. That's up to you. Okay, so now I'm going to open these parentheses, and I'm going to group. Now, out of my first 2 terms, I could take out a 4b. So now I have to open another parenthesis, and that's going to leave me with b plus 2. Okay, close those up. Now, out of the next 2 terms, the only thing I could factor out is a 1. So I'm not just going to put a 1, I'm going to put plus 1, right? I'm factoring out a positive 1, which leaves me with b plus 2. Now I have to close these parentheses, but I also have to close these ones that I originally opened. So you have parentheses within parentheses. If you don't like to have parentheses within parentheses, you could also use brackets like this. Okay, that's totally up to you. Okay, so now let's bring down that greatest common factor of the negative 2b, and then I'm going to group together this 4b plus 1, right? I'm going to group together the terms that are in front of our common factor. And then I'm going to take that b plus 2, that common factor, and I'm going to rewrite it once and once only. And this is fully factored, okay? Only because we can't factor any further.